Few kinds of music evoke such a vivid image as Norwegian black metal. The harshness of its sound only matched by its ideology, a permanent quest to become as extreme as possible. This ideology was the creation of a group of metalhead teenagers that, knowingly or not, pioneered a subgenre of music with the sole purpose of turning the majority of people away from it. However, the process of weeding out the uncommitted attracted those willing to act on their impulses, leading to extreme antisocial behavior that spiraled out of control and became a worldwide scandal. Murder, arson, and other unsavory topics were permanently tied to black metal and became synonymous with the band at the center of it all, Mayhem. These controversies, fueled by relentless media coverage, eclipsed the struggles and achievements of the young musicians behind the headlines. Although labeled satanic terrorists by the newspapers and magazines, they were largely unorganized, and the motives for their crimes ranged from internal group conflicts to morbid curiosity. But perhaps most interesting of all, none of the satanic terrorists actually worshipped Satan. So how exactly did such violence become intertwined with black metal, and what role did Mayhem play in the events that took place in the quiet and peaceful Norwegian villages? Mayhem's founding members had very different ambitions than high-profile crimes and tabloid headlines. Jørn Stubberud and Kjetil Mannheim lived in a small village called Langhus, close to the country's capital, Oslo. They played bass and drums respectively and started a rock band together called Musta, meaning black in Finnish. This band would last 4 years, and within that period, they discovered music from Motorhead and Black Sabbath, as well as artists with a harder edge to their sound, like Dead Kennedys, Bathory, Hellhammer, and Venom. With lyrics about witchcraft and overt Satanism, Venom left the biggest impression on Jørn and Kjetil and inspired them to play faster, heavier, and more outrageous music. Although Venom didn't take their image or message too seriously, the young musicians wanted to believe otherwise. Musta were determined to surpass their idols and wouldn't make that a reality until meeting their guitar player and main creative force, Øystein Aarseth. Jørn went to the neighboring town of Ski to audition for another band. There he met Øystein, who went to pick him up at the train station and take him to the audition's address. A few minutes of talking while on their way to the audition was all they needed to realize they had to start a band together. Both of them wanted to make their own music and even knew the same cover songs. Jørn was surprised they didn't know about each other despite living so close. They became friends on the spot, and Mayhem formally started in 1984. Named after Venom's song Mayhem with Mercy, the band had found its first lineup, but wouldn't play their first live performance until mid-April of 1985 as part of the Norwegian Championships of Rock, a small music contest held at the cinema in Øystein's town. Eirik Norheim, going by the stage name Messiah, provided vocals for the Venom and Celtic Frost covers that formed this setlist. Clad in black leather, inverted crosses, and proto-corpse paint, Mayhem delivered a performance most of the audience weren't prepared for. Eric Messiah repeatedly taunted the audience. Jörn snapped his bass in half, and Eystein let them know how he truly felt about their award show. They came in last place of the competition. But it was only a matter of time before they met someone who understood what they wanted to do and helped them establish connections with other like-minded people all over the world, and further Mayhem's influence. The man responsible for helping Mayhem develop was Jon Christiansen, better known as Metallion, who was entirely responsible for writing, designing, and distributing an independent music magazine called Slayer. Metallion met Mayhem outside of a Motorhead concert in 1985, after Jörn and Eystein bought Slayer from him. A few months later, and with the help of some acquaintances, Metallion spoke with Jörn on the phone and was eventually invited to their rehearsal space. They bonded over music and horror films. As their friendship grew, Mayhem was featured several times very positively on Metallion's magazine. The scene proved so popular among the underground that many other scenes started emerging from the Scandinavian region, citing Slayer as an influence. This success would help spread interest in Mayhem before a single recording was in circulation. The members adopted pseudonyms like other metal bands had done before them, and to make their names easier to pronounce for non-Norwegians. These alternate identities appeared on issues number 3 and 4 of the Slayer scene. Jörn became Necrobutcher. Kjetil went with his last name, Mannheim. Their temporary vocalist, Eirik, kept Messiah. And Eystein went a step further, dyed his hair black, and was briefly known as Destructor, but ultimately dubbed himself after a lesser-known demon of Greek origin found in Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible as Euronymous. Although Mayhem knew about the Church of Satan movement and even ordered a copy of the Satanic Bible from America, they were not affiliated or practiced anything resembling organized religion. They were curious about its contents, but found themselves disappointed. LaVey's book seemed far too tame for them. Much like Venom, Mayhem loosely adopted the book's anti-society and anti-religion ideals, a fitting match for any young band wanting to rebel against the conservative and Christian society of Norway. Satanism was just another color in their creative palette. And they made good use of it on their first official release, the rehearsal cassette tape Pure Fucking Armageddon in 1986. Exhibiting the limitations of a boombox microphone recording, PFA's raw, unedited sound proved very divisive among the few people aware of the band's existence. Its audio quality was universally criticized by fanzine editors, but some gave favorable reviews towards its primitive take on death metal. But their true breakthrough came a year later with Death Crush. Gore, necrophilia, the Antichrist, and chainsaws. For a death metal recording, Death Crush was fairly eclectic. Among the tracks, it featured an electronic drum composition by Tangerine Dream's Konrad Schnitzler, a feat Eystein accomplished after visiting Schnitzler's home uninvited, and waiting outside until Schnitzler and his wife let him in out of pity. A solo piano performance by band's drummer Kjetil, and, with humor not lost on them, an improvised a cappella cover of All the Little Flowers Are Happy by Cliff Richard and the cast of the British sitcom The Young Ones. After a brief microphone placement and volume check, Mayhem recorded what some regard as the biggest influence in Norwegian black metal, despite not sounding very much like the former. Now recorded on more favorable conditions, the sound quality received a massive upgrade, despite the recording engineers not knowing how to mix this kind of music. For the piercing, banshee-like vocals, Mayhem invited former vocalist Messiah, as well as Damage Inc. fanzine editor Sven Erik Christiansen, going by the stage name Maniac, whose Septic Cunts demo tape greatly impressed Eystein. Death Crush cost an approximate 5,000 Norwegian crowns, paid entirely by Jørn, who was the only member with a job. After recording was done, they pressed their record on vinyl out of their own pocket. It was at this time that one of Eystein's ambitions was beginning to materialize. Since they didn't have a record label backing them up, he decided to release Death Crush under his own, Poser Corps Music, Inc. Poser Corps was only a name, but it was Eystein's intention to expand into a recording label business and release other artists' music. And being independent didn't come without its problems. The cover for the album was supposed to be an intense blood red color, but the printing shop made it hot pink. For a cover displaying a pair of severed hands, they found the color to be distasteful. So distasteful that they ended up liking it out of spite. Adding insult to injury, Eystein's name was missing from the sleeves, so he had to write his name by hand on each one of the 1,000 copies. It also included a brief dedication to Metallion for all his support. Now tasked with the arduous labor of promoting an underground record by themselves, Jørn and Eystein were aided by Metallion, visiting his contacts over Europe, talking face-to-face in an effort to network for gigs and interviews, as well as selling as many copies of Death Crush as possible. Slowly, the word got out, and Eystein started to have ample mail correspondence. PFA and Death Crush received mixed to negative reviews from foreign magazine writers, including Metal Forces, but was more favorably received among hardcore fanzines, describing Mayhem as having a cult following. While Jørn and Eystein were completely devoted to the band, this wasn't the case for the rest of the members. Mayhem had existed for over 3 years, and Kjetil didn't want to continue, as he felt the band had run its course. He quit shortly after Death Crush's recording to focus on finding a job for financial stability and to live with his girlfriend. Sven Erik did the same due to living over 250 kilometers away, making rehearsing and recording very difficult. Both of them left on good terms and remained in contact with Eystein for years after. As a result of these departures, Jørn and Eystein recruited temporary drum and vocal replacements from the thrash band Vomit. But they didn't match the serious tone Mayhem was going for, and only stayed for a couple of months, until one day Jørn received the most bizarre package he had ever seen. The package that reached Jørn's P.O. box in Langhus contained the rotting corpse of a mouse, crucified in a makeshift cross made of wooden sticks. Along with this sick present, there was a cassette tape from the Swedish band called Morbid. Jørn couldn't handle the smell, so he threw the box away and the contact information with it, but kept the tape, and after listening to it in his car, was convinced they had found their new vocalist. Per Yngve Olin, about to be 19 years old, was the singer on this tape and the one responsible for the rodent's crucifixion. He read a review about Mayhem in the Metal Forces magazine and became a big fan of their music, So he sent the tape in order to audition for them as a vocalist. The Swedish singer fit the more extreme direction Øystein was looking for, and Metallion contacted him after writing about his band Morbid on his fanzine. Metallion developed a strong friendship with Per, or as his friends nicknamed him, Pelle. Over a couple of months of phone conversations, enough trust was formed, and Pelle went to rehearse with Mayhem in the winter of 1987. But this was a one-way trip. He moved to Norway right away, abandoning his education and leaving his family behind in Sweden. He brought all his possessions with him, which, according to Jorn, wasn't even a full suitcase. He had to rotate houses for a while until Mayhem found a place to rent and move in together. Pelle did not know any Norwegian, so they had to speak English to understand each other, making communication even more awkward. At this time, Mayhem lived in what could be considered poverty, and whatever money they received from welfare was used to keep Øystein's growing network of correspondence afloat, and to have the bare minimum to eat and live. On that note, they seldom ate, especially Pelle, who deliberately avoided doing so in order to look as sickly and pale as possible. It was obvious from the beginning that Pelle's fascination with death and the afterlife was not for show. He had a near-death experience when he was younger, which he attributed to an injury which ruptured his spleen while ice skating. He had to be rushed to the hospital in a condition so critical he stopped breathing and lost his pulse. In this momentary death, he saw strange blue and white colors, unlike anything he had seen. After recovering, he went looking for answers and spoke to a friend of his who convinced him that he had an out-of-body experience and visited another plane of existence where only the dead can go. But Pelle wasn't telling the whole truth about how he got his injury. In reality, his ruptured spleen was the result of a severe beatdown, the culmination of harsh and constant bullying he suffered as a middle schooler. The incident was so bad he had to change schools right after, where he met his friends that formed Morbid with him. Those memories left him disturbed and enthralled with death. He channeled this vast source of inspiration through drawings, song lyrics, and his musician persona, Dead. And Dead was a full-fledged concept. Even though there were other bands who had a similar idea, he coined the term corpse paint to refer to his particular style of makeup. He also kept small, dead animals in bags that he would inhale in order to immerse himself in death before performing or recording. Pelle's persona was an invaluable asset for Øystein's vision of the band. Months later, still in 1988, Jan Axel Blomberg joined Mayhem after sending them a demo tape of his drum playing. Like Pelle, Jan Axel heard Death Crush and drove to Oslo to meet the band. Øystein particularly liked his double bass technique, a very straightforward affair. Mayhem called to welcome him the very next day. Since all the band members had pseudonyms, Jan Axel picked Hellhammer for himself. Once again, the lineup was complete and could begin to write and hopefully record new music. Up until now, Jorn wrote most of the lyrics, but quickly relegated the task to Pelle as his lyrics delved into the occult and had a darker, more personal edge. That same year, they recorded 2 new songs featuring Pelle's lyrics, Freezing Moon and Carnage. However, this recording wouldn't see the light of day until 2 years later, under the compilation Projections of a Stained Mind, made possible thanks to one of Pelle's former bandmates. This delay was a symptom of a much larger problem Øystein would have with Pelle over the next 3 years. Øystein was a perfectionist and described Mayhem's exhaustive creative process in interviews as rewriting the music until it could be rewritten no longer. He also spoke at length about several legs of the tour he had in mind for the band, like the USSR and South America, and to, hopefully, play in countries under stricter socialist regimes like Albania, China, Mongolia, North Korea, among others. In contrast, Pelle was often frustrated with how long it was taking them to write and release music, as well as questioning how realistic touring in such closed-off countries would be. Most of this tour schedule never materialized. In fact, Mayhem didn't play a gig for a little over 2 years since Pelle and Jan Axel joined the band. Most of that time was spent writing what would be Mayhem's third release and official debut, The Mysteries dom Satanas. Pelle chose the title most likely after a religious ritual magic book he was looking for called The Mysteries by Iamblikas. The band rented a house in the small village of Kurokstad to have their own rehearsal space. At first, Øystein, Pelle, and Jan Axel moved in to make use of the $1,200 rent they had to pay. Living in such close quarters made the friction between them grow to a point where Jan Axel moved out to his grandmother's house, only returning to rehearse. Even Øystein didn't stay there completely, as he often visited his parents' house over at Ski. An alternative Pelle did not have. He kept little contact with his family in Sweden, but wrote letters to some pen pals of his about records, flyers, as well as what little gigs they played. After a long time waiting, the band finally gave their first live show with their new lineup on February 3rd, 1990 in Jessheim, Norway. This gig introduced a mostly unsuspecting crowd to Mayhem's new stage show. They impaled decapitated pig heads on stakes, who were violently thrown around, and most notably, Pelle cut his arm with a knife on stage with the intention of pouring his blood on the front row, leaving only true fans in the audience. The prop was provided by Jørn, who only agreed to this antic knowing the knife was blunt and hoped Pelle wouldn't seriously hurt himself. It turned out Pelle was committed to his act, so after failing to cut himself with the knife, he broke a beer bottle and used its remains to dig in his arm and finish the job the knife was set to do. The bleeding was so severe, he needed to be bandaged almost immediately with whatever cloth or rag was at hand at the venue. But this didn't stop him. He returned to sing the very last song of the set. What little was left of the audience after such a display were those who had anticipated Mayhem's performance for years. Among them were members of future bands that helped define the sound for black metal, including Darkthrone, Emperor, Immortal, and Thorns. Øystein was stoked with Pelle's performance and encouraged him in the hopes of furthering Mayhem's image as one, if not the most extreme metal band there ever was. Jørn, on the other hand, thought it went too far, and it wasn't worth the risk of such injuries for a vision of the band's future. This caused a rift in Jørn's and Øystein's friendship, and would only worsen as time went on. What followed that performance was another gig in Sarpsborg, Norway, and a string of disastrous live shows in Germany and Turkey. Mayhem booked 6 gigs over Europe, happening between November and December of the same year. Due to poor planning and bad luck, only 4 gigs took place. During this tour, they were faced with several hurdles, such as traveling by trains that didn't have a toilet or a comfortable place to sleep, being detained by customs, made to pay fees and exchange money for local currencies at rip-off prices, not having access to showers or decent meals, getting lost in countries they didn't know the language of, playing for minuscule crowds, and in some instances, traveling several hundred kilometers to have the show cancelled by the police, or by the host band ditching them for a record deal signing taking place that same day. Just to name a few. 3 out of 4 gigs, all in Germany, did not pay. The only one that did was the one in Izmir, Turkey, for approximately $100, less than what Mayhem agreed to before playing. The Turkish host band had to sell their instruments to get this sum. Although the tour wasn't a complete failure, morale wasn't the highest by the time they returned to Norway. Back at their house in Kurokstad, infighting between Øystein and Pelle continued, followed by another period of inactivity that weathered Pelle's mental state. Øystein spent most of his time at the house developing the idea for a record shop under his label, now renamed Death Like Silence Productions, telling Pelle that once the shop was up and running, they would have the money to record further and improve their living situation. The other members knew most of it was empty talk, and Pelle wasn't tolerating Øystein's attitude anymore. He had been away from home for the better part of 3 years and had little to show for it. His father contacted him earlier to convince him to move back to Sweden, to study art at an alternative school. What he thought about all of this is a mystery, as he didn't tell his bandmates and became more reclusive than before. Easter arrived in early April, and the band members left for their respective homes to celebrate, except for Pelle. He didn't have a place to turn outside the band while living in Norway. He stayed that weekend alone at the Kurokstad home. He had a brief run-in with Jan Axel in Ski shortly after and told him he had bought a new knife, which he repeatedly described as very sharp. Their only neighbor in the Kurokstad area saw him too, and later told Jørn that Pelle seemed very happy. The night of the 8th of April 1991, Per Yngve Olin, aged 22, ended his own life. At first, he tried to slash his wrists and bleed out in the nearby forest, but in the end, he went inside the house and shot himself in the head with a shotgun that had been there since the band moved in. Øystein went back to check on him on Sunday afternoon and knocked on the door, waiting for Pelle to open since he had the only copy of the house's key. There was no answer. Later that day, Øystein called Jørn to ask him if Pelle wasn't at his house. He wasn't. "He is surely hanging and dangling around his room," Øystein answered. An odd choice of words, Jørn thought to himself. The next Monday, Øystein grabbed a ladder and climbed towards Pelle's room, which had an open window. Upon reaching the top, he was met with the gruesome scene that the remains of the singer made. But before contacting the police, he went out of his way to drive back to the nearest town, buy a disposable camera, and return in order to take pictures of the morbid event. He rearranged the body with the shotgun for a future album cover and took pieces of the fragmented skull that were scattered within the room. These fragments would later become necklaces given to distinct individuals within the scene at his discretion. He called Jan Axel and Jørn, letting them know seemingly unfazed about what had transpired, as well as his intentions of using the photos of Pelle's corpse as an album cover for a Mayhem release. "Pelle has gone home," said Eystein while on the phone with Jörn. "Gone home? To Sweden?" replied Jörn. "No. He killed himself." Shocked and repulsed by his bandmates' behavior, Jörn told Eystein to never contact him again until he destroyed those pictures. He effectively left the band right away. Pelle's funeral took place a few weeks after that in Stockholm, Sweden. Jörn attended. Jan Axel and Eystein did not. Limited to fanzines and letters, news from the suicide didn't spread right away. Those immediate to Mayhem found out as they helped clean Pelle's room, that for some reason was left as it was after the police retrieved the body. Eystein capitalized on the situation and mythologized the band and his persona Euronymous by letting rumors spread about him being the killer, and later attributing his bandmates' untimely death to such things as the scene being taken over by uncommitted fans or his supposed hatred for the world and everything which lives on it. The plans for opening up a shop for his record label came true mere months after Pelle's death in the summer of 1991. It would be called Helvete, meaning hell in Norwegian. His motivations were financial as well as social. The shop would function as a main gathering point for like-minded musicians and acquaintances. A number of people would help him set up the shop by donating vinyl records, chains, weapons, and other paraphernalia to decorate the interior. Opening a specialty music shop in Oslo was an expensive and risky proposition, so he accepted a compromise in the form of selling records that weren't of his liking, namely death metal, much to his dismay. But the bands that would press their records and distribute under the Death Like Silence Productions label would be curated by him. The shop solidified Eystein, or Euronymous, as a big influence on the few people that were allowed inside. They were mostly teenagers who had seen Mayhem live or were curious about this new and still forming type of music. As an older figure and the leader of Mayhem, most bands looked up to him and changed the music they played originally to fit into the concept Eystein talked about constantly. The most notable example were the band Darkthrone, who despite their young age, were signed to the independent label Peacebill Records and had already released an album. Originally a death metal band, Darkthrone completely changed their sound and image after hanging around in Helvete right after it opened. They recorded their second album, A Blaze in the Northern Sky, at Creative Studios, the same place Mayhem recorded Death Crush. The album was dedicated to Eystein. The fizzy guitars, tremolo picking riffs, and emphasis on a cold and hostile ambience made it a landmark in Norwegian black metal. The production was deliberately sparse and light on bass frequencies in order to achieve a colder sound. When presented with A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Peacebill did not want to publish it due to it sounding weak and the wild stylistic shift Darkthrone had since their last record. But after threatening to release it under Eystein's label, Peacebill yielded and released it in early 1992. All this being said, Eystein wasn't universally revered. Some of his older friends that helped him set up the shop and pay the rent were skeptical of his management skills. One of them was Stian Johansen, known as Occultus. He joined Mayhem as a bass player when Jörn left, but had an altercation with Eystein, which presumably ended in death threats. Despite his monetary contributions, he never saw a return in his investment and criticized Mayhem's long-standing tradition of inactivity. Those close to Einstein were a tightly knit group, and they learned to dismiss his threats as empty and impulsive. These sort of attitudes were either seen as normal or tolerated from younger members due to the ideas they surrounded themselves with and willingness to go along with the leaders of the group. Einstein and others within the group would sometimes refer to it as the Black Circle to make it seem organized, bigger, and more menacing than what it actually was. Very rarely did this group expand and welcome new members. One such occasion was when Einstein discovered a one-man band called Burzum, which left him so impressed that he talked the author, Count Grishnak, into releasing his debut album on DSP. Burzum was the creation of an 18-year-old named Christian Vikernes. Christian quickly became a prominent figure in the black metal community. He came from a different town, no one really knew who he was, and he had already catched Einstein's interest. Described as intelligent and kept to himself, the native from Bergen forged a working relationship with Einstein as the new bass player for Mayhem. At the same time, Einstein contributed a guitar solo for Burzum's self-titled album in the song War, and playing a gong by beating it with his fists in the song Dungeons of Darkness. He even was credited as co-producer in the first pressings of the album in March of 1992. They fueled each other's extreme tendencies and beliefs until one of them put their words into practice and started a series of infamous events that set the small community on a collision course towards national and international headlines. The rejection of Christianity that had been brewing since Mayhem's early years came to a boiling point with Christian's arrival. On June 6, 1992, newspapers reported the burning of one of Norway's buildings considered as cultural heritage, a staff church. Staff church was the name given to Christian churches built since the Middle Ages, fashioned with Scandinavian motifs like dragon head statues and roofing similar to reptile scales. Staff churches burning down was uncommon, but not unheard of. Since the entire construction of these traditional buildings is made out of wood, some of them had perished to natural causes like lightning strikes or human error like faulty electrical installation. But this wasn't the case. It was a premeditated act of violence by one or several of the members belonging to the small Norwegian black metal community in Oslo. The staff church that burned down was located in Christian's hometown, Bergen. As such, he was heavily suspected of being the culprit. The media found no connection to the black metal community though, leaving them unpunished and feeling empowered to continue their vandalism. Just over 2 months later, one member of the Black Circle would inadvertently outdo the burnings, this time by murder. Bård Eitun was an 18-year-old known as Faust in the black metal circle. He was the drummer of the bands Emperor and Thorns, and had been working at Helvete for about a year since the opening in 1991. His bandmates at Emperor often mentioned Bård had a fascination with serial killers that had been developing for some time. Perhaps influenced by the church burnings a few months prior, on August 21st, he stabbed a man to death late at night while going back to his hometown, Lillehammer. The victim was Magd Andresen. While Bård was walking home through a park set up for the upcoming Winter Olympic Games, Andresen approached him, hinting at going somewhere private to have sexual relationships. Bård understood the homosexual man's advances, but instead of declining, he agreed, since he decided in that moment that he wanted to kill him. They walked far to an isolated part of the woods nearby the park. Once they were alone, Bard pulled out a knife he was carrying and stabbed Andresen multiple times in his stomach, neck, and back. Right after making sure the man was dead, he hurried back to his mother's house. Bard claims no one saw him return. He entered the house and washed the blood off himself and his clothes. His mother was asleep and didn't notice. The next afternoon, after Bard returned to Oslo, he told Øystein and Christian what he had done. This presumably pleased both of them, and they invited Bard to another church burning, this time in a nearby town in Oslo. The Holmenkollen Chapel was set ablaze in the early hours of the morning on August 23rd. Both the murder and the arson of the chapel left the police perplexed, as these crimes seemed to happen randomly and without leaving a trace. The motive for the murder wasn't clear, even for Bard. A combination of curiosity and acting on impulse. Several staff churches burned across Norway and Sweden through 1992 and early 1993, both as spontaneous actions of the Black Circle and indirectly from independent groups that never had contact with the black metal community in Oslo. This complete impunity allowed Mayhem to continue their arduous and extremely long process of writing and recording new music. Still working on De Mysteries Dom Satanas, Øystein invited 2 more members to fulfill recording duties. From the band Thorns and former bandmate of Bard Aitun, Snorre Ruk on second guitar, and from the Hungarian band Tormentor, Attila Csihar on vocals. Snorre joined in late 1992 and worked with Øystein on the riffs and the overall sound of guitars. He took several completed riffs from his project Thorns and adapted them for Mayhem. His style was influential, to say the least. Attila was a pen pal of Øystein for years before being invited to sing on Mayhem's The Mysteries. He only went to Norway for 2 weeks in order to rehearse and record in early 1993. His Hungarian accent and theatrical performance convinced Øystein to completely change the style of vocals that he had in mind from Pelle's original versions. The recording of The Mysteries was a thorough process. Aided by producer Eirik Hundvin, Mayhem recorded all instruments at Bergen's Greek Hall, a concert hall for orchestras and opera. Øystein and the producer went out of their way to find the best spots for recording every instrument in the concert hall. Drums were recorded at the main stage to capture the natural reverberations and give the drums a large, lush sound. For guitars, Øystein recorded several performances of the same rhythm guitar parts to sum them in order to get a bigger and denser sound, a practice known as overdubbing. The Mysteries was crafted carefully and was a cut above in terms of sound polish of its black metal contemporaries, who deliberately adopted a less produced sound for several reasons. While the recording of The Mysteries was happening, Christian described his time in Mayhem as very satisfactory and had been busy recording music for his own project, Burzum, since mid-1992. He also legally changed his name from Christian to Varg. Under this new name, he set out to gather publicity for his upcoming Burzum release, Oske, meaning ashes in Norwegian. The cover art blatantly featured the torched Van Toft Staff Church, and adding insult to injury, the first 1,000 copies came with a lighter. Varg's first step was to contact local news reporters in his hometown of Bergen, claiming to know who was behind multiple arsons since last year and the murder of the homosexual man in Lillehammer. The two reporters couldn't sell the story to the newspaper, Bergens Tidende, but it caught the attention of another reporter called Finn Bjørn Tondir, who was informed by the police months prior about an arson that happened on Christmas Eve of 1992. Finn convinced the reporters to arrange a second interview with Bark, where Finn would assure Bark that he would get the exposure he wanted as long as what he said about the burnings could be cross-referenced with the police report. Bark allegedly gave information that linked the black metal community at Oslo with several arsons and the murder of Magne Andresen. While being careful in admitting guilt or mentioning any names, Bark made it abundantly clear that there were several people involved, and the attacks on the churches were of anti-Christian nature. This sparked the interest of both the police and the media to start investigating this alleged group of satanic terrorists that were on the loose. The same day the Bergens Tidende article came out, police arrested Bark in order to get a confession. Finn Tondir said he protected his source, and the police arrived at suspecting Bark independently, while Bark maintains that the reporter gave the police his home address, along with other information for his arrest to take place. Bark was incarcerated for 6 weeks, but was let go free of charges in early March since he didn't confess to any crimes and police lacked physical evidence to convict him. While in custody, he declared his claims on the interview with Finn were a complete fabrication and was just a publicity stunt for his upcoming album. Bursum's Oske was released right after Bark was set free. All this media attention got the police department on alert for any suspicious activity that could be linked to Satanism, especially if it related to Bark's acquaintances. The pressure made Eystein close his shop, presumably at the request of his parents, in order to keep a low profile until things calmed down. But, as if pouring gasoline on a fire, on March 27th, an interview for Kerrang, one of the most popular rock magazines at the time, was published, with a prominent photo of Bark alongside a headline reading, "Arson, Death, Satanic Ritual, The Ugly Truth About Black Metal." The interviews with Eystein and Bark, as well as background research, were credited to 3 different people. The outlandish claims of the musicians that were so common in fanzines were perceived very differently on an article with worldwide exposure, even if the report was presented more as a tabloid than an interview. Whether Eystein and Bark were telling the truth or not, it mattered very little to the massive influx of curious readers worldwide and the Norwegian residents who picked up on the story after the constant local coverage. Bark became frustrated at Eystein's response to the coverage, claiming he did it to boost sales for his own music and to help Helvete solve some of its debt. Eystein was understandably angry at Bark for making the police aware of their crimes and the constant scrutiny that they were now facing. Their relationship soured and got worse as summer approached. Bark was already considering releasing Bursum's upcoming music through another label. He even went to the UK in April to negotiate a multi-album record deal with Earache Records. The people at Earache got cold feet after speaking to him and finding his political views too radical and incompatible with the label. He chose to release under his own label later on. Many people in the inner circle noticed the animosity between Bark and Eystein, but weren't sure what it was about. On August 9, Snorre received a phone call from Eystein while visiting Bark's house in Bergen. Eystein told him that he wanted to kill Bark. Snorre knew this threat was likely empty and done in a fit of anger. Unbeknownst to both of them, Bark overheard their conversation. Regardless of Eystein's true intentions, Bark took the threat seriously and devised a plan to kill Eystein that night preemptively. He would drive from Bergen to Eystein's apartment building in Oslo and would convince him to let him in order to discuss his contract with Death Like Silence Productions. Once inside, he would attack the unsuspecting leader of Mayhem. Snorre and another unnamed person that were at Bark's house tried to persuade him of not going through with his plan, but it was no use. Bark coerced both of them to take part in the scheme. Snorre was in a very delicate state of mind at the time, alluding, but not admitting, to having psychiatric issues and being under a lot of stress. Compounding this, he suffered from a rare stomach disease that made him have low blood sugar levels constantly, affecting his personality and possibly his decision-making. Bark's peer pressure was the last factor that made him a conscious accomplice. Snorre agreed to drive alongside Bark to Eystein's apartment to carry out the crime. The third person, who wasn't a known musician in the scene, stayed in Bergen and would provide an alibi for Snorre and Bark. The drive was at least 7 hours. They arrived at the very early hours of the morning. Bark got out of the car and rang Eystein's apartment number through the intercom. A wary and confused voice answered. Bark said he had come to talk, and that Eystein should let him in. Eystein said it was late and that he should come back some other day. Bark insisted again. After some back and forth, Eystein reluctantly let him in. They talked for a while about the contract before Bark pulled out a knife and stabbed Eystein multiple times in his back, neck, and head. During the struggle, a lamp broke and the glass cut one of the main arteries in Eystein's foot, as well as leaving several puncture wounds on his body. In the early hours of the morning of the 10th of August 1993, Eystein Arseth, aged 25, was found dead on the stairs of the apartment building. Later that day, while Bard was about to visit Eystein, he was met with police officers and patrols parked outside the building. News rushed to the community, leaving most of them on edge, unsure if they were now targets of the mystery killer. Rival extreme metal scenes from Sweden and Finland were suspected, but it was just a matter of time before the police followed the trail Bark left behind. He left his contract signed and dated at Eystein's apartment. A full police investigation went underway. The police interrogated regulars at Helvete, including teenagers that were persuaded into giving incriminating testimony for the church burnings, the murder of the man in Lillehammer, and Eystein's last days. Once the police had several testimony accounts, including Snorre's, and they confirmed Bark's fingerprints in the blood at the crime scene, they had enough evidence to arrest him once again, the 19th of August 1993. The media coverage truly exploded after Bark's arrest. The following months saw the court hearing for many of the musicians involved in several crimes over the years, and effectively put most of the Norwegian black metal scene on a standstill. Among the most notable are Bård Eidun, who confessed the murder of Magne Andresen and received a 14-year sentence. Snorre Ruk received 8 years for his participation in Eystein Arseth's murder. His sentence was lowered after taking into consideration his medical condition and general mental instability. Bark Bikenes was convicted for the murder of Eystein Arseth, the arson of the Åsane Church, Holmenkollen Chapel, and the Skjold Church, as well as several robberies and illegal possession of weapons and explosives. He was given 21 years in prison, Norway's longest possible sentence. The hearing took place almost a year after his arrest in April and May of 1994. A few days before his death, Øystein gave a fanzine interview where he made a rather ominous statement about the future of black metal. When questioned about black metal becoming a trend, Øystein answered, "Those who talk about a big black metal trend here should keep silent if they don't have eyes to see with." The day Mayhem sells 20,000 records in Norway, Burzum is on MTV every day, and Nuclear Blast have signed 8 black metal bands, then you can start talking about trend.
And tonight, something very special. We're playing you the brand new epic video from the king of the Norwegian black metal scene, Burzum.
From this moment on, it's safe to say that black metal became bigger than any of the people involved could ever imagine it to be. Right after Bark's sentence, Mayhem's De Mysteris Dom Satanas was finally released to universal acclaim. Before the release of De Mysteris, Øystein's family requested Bark's bass recordings to be removed from the album. Jan Axel assured them he would do so and re-record them himself, but he never did. The year earlier, Jørn and Jan Axel reunited at Øystein's funeral and decided that despite what happened, Mayhem had to continue. Jørn had a band with Sven Erik, one of Mayhem's former vocalists from the Death Crush era, and auditioned guitar players over the following months. Mayhem's reunion had a mixed response from the community, some claiming Mayhem couldn't continue without Øystein. Regardless, black metal got a gigantic publicity push that not only helped Mayhem, but many other bands to break the hundreds of thousands of records sold and even crossed onto the mainstream with music that was originally designed to keep away as many people as possible. An almost private interpretation of their reality only meant for those they deemed worthy. Since their reunion, Mayhem